It was one of those rare quiet afternoons. The kind where the sun is just the right amount of golden, casting a warm glow over the city streets. Sandra Bullock, looking for a brief escape from the whirlwind of her daily life, stepped into a small, charming restaurant tucked away in a corner of downtown. She wasn't in the mood for anything fancy, just a simple, peaceful meal. She was greeted by the hostess, a polite woman with a soft smile, and led to a cozy table by the window. The restaurant was nearly empty, with only a few patrons scattered across the room, engaged in their own quiet conversations. Sandra settled into the plush chair, enjoying the moment of solitude as the soft hum of the restaurant filled the air. As she flipped through the menu, a sudden movement caught her eye. A little girl, no more than 5, was sitting alone at a corner table. Her clothes were worn, her shoes scuffed, and there was a quiet sadness in her eyes that Sandra couldn't ignore. The girl was playing with a crumpled napkin, her small hands folding and unfolding it, as if trying to pass the time. Sandra's heart clenched. She couldn't fathom why a child so young would be alone in a place like this, looking so lost. The restaurant was known for its upscale vibe, the kind of place where you'd expect to see professionals having lunch or couples on dates, not a little girl sitting alone, without a meal, without anyone to watch over her. The waitress came to take Sandra's order, but Sandra found herself distracted. She glanced over at the girl again. There was something about her, an innocence mixed with a kind of quiet resilience that tugged at Sandra's heart. Before she could stop herself, Sandra stood up and walked over to the girl's table. "Hey there," Sandra said softly, trying to keep her voice warm and friendly. "Are you okay?" The little girl looked up, her eyes wide with surprise, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her. There was a brief pause before she nodded, but Sandra could tell that the girl's silence spoke volumes. "Would you like to join me for lunch?" Sandra asked, her heart beating a little faster now. "I could use some company." The girl hesitated for a moment, then nodded again. Sandra smiled and motioned to the waitress, who had been watching the interaction from a distance. The waitress, a woman in her late 20s with a stern expression, approached the table. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge of skepticism. "This isn't a place for children, especially, well, you know." Sandra blinked, taken aback by the comment. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a little sharper than she intended. "You know," the waitress continued, her tone dismissive. "People like her don't really fit in here. It's not exactly the kind of place for, well, her kind." Sandra felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. What kind of place was this, that it would judge a child based on the way she looked or the clothes she wore? The little girl, who had been silently watching the exchange, fidgeted in her seat. Sandra's heart ached. She wanted to say something, but the words were stuck in her throat. Instead, she smiled at the little girl, trying to offer some comfort, and then looked up at the waitress. "I think she deserves a seat at this table just like anyone else," Sandra said, her voice firm but kind. "If you have a problem with that, I'll take my business elsewhere." The waitress hesitated, but then just nodded, turning away without saying another word. Sandra sat back down, her thoughts racing. She had expected a relaxing lunch, but now the weight of the situation was settling in, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on here than met the eye. She looked back at the little girl, who was still sitting silently, her hands playing with the napkin. There was something about her that made Sandra feel like this moment was more than just a random encounter. There was something pulling her to help, to make sure this child felt seen and valued in a world that often overlooked people like her. And just as she was about to say something to the little girl, the door to the restaurant swung open, drawing Sandra's attention. In walked none other than Keanu Reeves. He was casually dressed, looking effortlessly cool in a denim jacket and sunglasses, a wide smile on his face as he scanned the room. Sandra's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen him in person in ages, but there was no mistaking that familiar face. Keanu caught sight of Sandra almost immediately. He waved, his smile widening as he made his way toward her. Sandra stood up to greet him, momentarily distracted by the sudden appearance of her old friend. But the tension in the air hadn't completely disappeared. The little girl was still sitting there, quiet and alone, and Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to take a turn. "Hey, Sandra," Keanu said, his voice as warm as ever. "Long time no see." "Keanu. What are you doing here?" Sandra asked, her voice a little more relieved now. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd grab a bite to eat," Keanu replied with a shrug, still smiling. But his eyes, full of curiosity, drifted to the little girl sitting across from Sandra. For a moment, there was silence. Sandra felt like there was something she should say, some explanation to offer about the situation, but before she could, the waiter arrived with a tray of drinks. Keanu, noticing the tension, raised an eyebrow and glanced between Sandra and the little girl, his gaze sharp and calculating. And then, without missing a beat, he turned to the waiter. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. "Because if there is, I think we should talk about it." The tension in the restaurant seemed to grow the moment Keanu spoke. It wasn't loud or confrontational, but his calm, measured tone carried an undeniable authority that made everyone pause. The waiter, already uncomfortable with the situation, faltered for a moment. Sandra could see his eyes dart between Keanu and the little girl before he straightened up, trying to regain control of the situation. No, Mr. Reeves, no problem here," the waiter stammered, avoiding Keanu's gaze. "It's just, we have rules, you know. This is a fine dining establishment, and, well, certain people don't really fit the ambience." Sandra's face flushed with anger. She had tried to stay calm, but hearing the waiter speak that way, especially in front of the child, made her blood boil. The little girl, who had been quietly observing the conversation, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Sandra could see the hurt in her eyes, and that was enough to push her into action. "What do you mean, certain people don't fit the ambience?" Sandra asked, her voice louder now, but not angry, just firm and incredulous. "Are you saying that this little girl doesn't belong here just because of her clothes? Because of the way she looks?" The waiter hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Sandra's directness. He looked over at the girl, then back to Sandra, his face flushed with embarrassment. But his words still hung in the air, thick with judgment. "She's just not, well, she doesn't belong in a place like this. It's not the right environment for someone like her," he muttered, looking away as though it was a simple fact of life. Sandra opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say another word, Keanu stepped forward. There was something about his quiet strength that made everyone in the room pause, as though his presence alone commanded respect. "Listen," Keanu said, his voice calm but serious. "I don't think I need to tell you who I am, but I'll say this anyway. Everyone has a right to be treated with dignity, no matter where they come from or what they're wearing. That includes her." He nodded toward the little girl. "And I don't think anyone should make assumptions about a child just because she looks different." The waiter looked as though he might argue, but Keanu's gaze was unwavering. The room grew eerily silent. Sandra felt a strange sense of relief at Keanu's words, as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. It was comforting to have someone by her side who wasn't afraid to speak up, especially in a moment like this. But the waiter still wasn't convinced. He shot a quick, nervous glance at the other patrons, who were now watching the exchange with growing interest. "I'm just saying," the waiter persisted, his tone defensive, "that if we make exceptions for one person, we might have to make them for everyone. And that could ruin the whole atmosphere of the place. We have standards to uphold." Keanu's expression remained calm, but Sandra could sense the subtle shift in his energy. His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked the waiter in the eye. "And what exactly are these standards you're so concerned about?" Keanu asked, his voice carrying just enough weight to make the question feel like an accusation. The waiter faltered, unsure of how to respond. He stammered a bit, trying to find the words, but they didn't come. Sandra could see that his confidence was slipping, replaced by uncertainty. I just mean, he started, but Keanu cut him off. Look, let's be clear. This isn't about rules or standards, Keanu said, his voice cutting through the tension. It's about kindness. You can't hide behind a set of standards to justify treating people poorly. That's not what this place should represent. And if it does, maybe you should rethink what kind of atmosphere you're trying to create. The waiter stood frozen, his face now flushed with both frustration and embarrassment. Sandra couldn't help but feel a rush of admiration for Keanu. He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk. He wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right, even if it meant going against the grain. Sandra looked down at the little girl, who had been silently watching the exchange the entire time. She could see that the girl was nervous, unsure of what was happening. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes now, hope, maybe. A tiny bit of reassurance that not everyone in the world would judge her for something she couldn't control. Sandra knelt down to the girl's level, offering a gentle smile. "Hey," she said softly. "You're safe here, okay? No one's going to hurt you. I promise." The little girl nodded, her eyes wide but grateful, and for a moment, Sandra felt like she had made a real difference. It wasn't just about feeding her, or giving her a place to sit. It was about showing her that there were people who saw her, people who cared, people who didn't care about where she came from or what she wore. The waiter, still standing awkwardly by the table, let out a deep sigh. "Fine," he muttered, sounding defeated. "I'll let it slide this time." Sandra could feel the tension begin to dissipate as Keanu gave the waiter a nod of acknowledgement, then turned back to her and the little girl. "You're doing good," Keanu said quietly, offering a reassuring smile. Sandra returned the smile, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. But even as the situation seemed to calm, there was a deeper undercurrent of frustration building inside her. This was just one small battle, but it wasn't over yet. The real challenge was changing how people like the waiter saw the world, and that was going to take time. Keanu took a seat at the table, his eyes glancing at the little girl. "What's your name?" he asked her gently. The little girl hesitated before answering. "Mia," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Well, Mia," Keanu said, his smile warm, "it's nice to meet you. And I think we've just made a few new friends here today, don't you?" Mia's face lit up with the smallest of smiles, and Sandra couldn't help but feel a surge of hope for the future. This was a moment, a small one, but still a moment of change. As the waiter walked away, Sandra turned to Keanu. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For stepping in. I don't think I could have handled that on my own." Keanu smiled again, his calm demeanor never wavering. No one should have to handle it alone. And with that, the three of them sat in a rare kind of peace, a silent bond forming between them as the rest of the world seemed to fade away. The afternoon wasn't over, but Sandra felt like something important had shifted, both for her and for the little girl sitting across from her. The battle wasn't over, but it had just taken its first, small step toward resolution. The air felt lighter as Sandra and Keanu sat together at the table with Mia. The restaurant, which had once felt tense and uncomfortable, now seemed like a haven, though Sandra couldn't completely shake off the lingering unease from the waiter's attitude. But Mia's small, tentative smile reminded her that sometimes, even the smallest gestures could make a huge difference in a person's life. Sandra tried to make small talk with the little girl, but Mia remained quiet, her fingers nervously twisting the napkin she had been playing with earlier. Sandra could tell that Mia wasn't used to being in the spotlight, especially not in a place like this. She wondered what her life was like, what circumstances had led her to be here, alone, in the first place. Keanu, noticing Mia's reticence, decided to step in. "So, Mia," he said, his tone gentle and inviting, "what's your favorite thing to do?" Do you like drawing or playing games? Mia glanced up at him, her big brown eyes hesitant at first, but then softened. She didn't answer immediately, instead looking down at her lap, as though she were considering whether it was okay to share. Sandra could feel her heart ache for the little girl. She had been through something that had made her wary, maybe even afraid to trust. The thought made Sandra's own chest tighten. Well, Mia finally spoke up, her voice soft but clear, I like to draw. I like drawing pictures of trees, and flowers, and sometimes people. Sandra's face brightened. That's wonderful. You must be really good at it. Do you have any pictures with you? Mia nodded slightly, and for the first time since Sandra had met her, there was a flicker of excitement in her eyes. I have one in my bag. It's a picture of a big tree, with a lot of leaves. I think it's pretty. Can I see it? Sandra asked, her voice warm. Mia hesitated for a moment, but then, as if making a decision, she reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. The drawing was simple, but beautiful in its own way. A large tree stood in the center of the page, its branches spread wide, reaching toward the edges of the paper. There were no details or fancy colors, just the shapes and lines of a child's imagination. That's amazing, Mia, Keanu said, his voice full of encouragement. I bet one day, your pictures will be all over the walls of art galleries. Mia's face flushed a little at the compliment, and she glanced up at Keanu shyly. The brief connection between them seemed to relax her further. For a moment, she didn't feel like the outcast or the invisible child. She felt like she mattered. Sandra leaned in, genuinely interested. Do you have any other pictures at home? She asked. Mia nodded, a little more eagerly this time. I have a lot of pictures at my aunt's house. I stay with her sometimes. Sandra felt a spark of hope. The mention of an aunt meant that Mia wasn't completely alone in the world. There were people who cared for her, at least sometimes. But that didn't answer the question of why she was here alone in the first place. Sandra's curiosity deepened, and she wanted to know more, but she didn't want to push the little girl too hard. Keanu, sensing the delicate nature of the conversation, shifted the focus. Hey, Mia, he said with a playful smile, do you want to make a deal? Mia's eyes brightened, a mixture of excitement and curiosity dancing across her face. What kind of deal? She asked, her voice small but full of interest. Well, here's the thing, Keanu began, leaning forward like he was telling her a secret, I'm really bad at drawing. But I bet you could teach me how to draw a tree like yours. What do you think? Mia's smile was a little hesitant at first, but then she nodded eagerly. Okay, she whispered, her voice warming. Keanu grinned, clearly pleased. Great. It's a deal then. But if I'm going to learn, I think we'll need some supplies, don't you think? At that, Sandra caught Keanu's playful wink. She laughed softly, feeling a sense of relief. The atmosphere around the table felt lighter now, as though Mia had started to trust them, trust that she wasn't going to be judged or turned away. Sandra stood up. I'll go grab some crayons and paper. You two stay here. I think we've got a lesson to teach Keanu. As Sandra made her way to the front of the restaurant, she couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. She had come here hoping for a quiet meal, a peaceful afternoon. But instead, she had found herself in a situation that had turned out to be far more meaningful than she could have anticipated. She had never expected to find herself sitting in a restaurant with Keanu Reeves, helping a lonely little girl who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her small shoulders. And yet, here they were. By the time Sandra returned to the table with crayons and paper in hand, she noticed that Keanu had already started sketching with Mia's help. She was showing him how to draw the tree, step by step, and Keanu was playing along with a lightheartedness that made the situation feel like a moment of pure joy, something Sandra hadn't expected to experience today. Mia, now with a little more confidence, was guiding him with precision. No, no, she corrected him, the branches are more like this, see? Her small finger drew a curved line in the air, demonstrating how the branches should stretch. Keanu's playful grin never faltered. Ah, I see. I think I'm getting it. You're a great teacher, Mia. Mia giggled, the sound light and sweet. Sandra watched, her heart swelling as she saw the bond forming between them. It wasn't just about the drawing. It was about something deeper. It was about connection. And in that moment, Sandra felt like they had crossed a threshold. They were no longer strangers in a restaurant, they were three people who had shared something real. Something that mattered. And as the drawing session continued, Sandra realized that this was only the beginning. Something had shifted inside her, inside all of them. She wasn't sure what would come next, but she knew one thing for sure, this moment had marked the start of something new. As the afternoon wore on, the mood in the restaurant had shifted entirely. The air, which had once been thick with discomfort, now felt warm and light. The waiter, who had reluctantly agreed to leave the situation alone, stayed far from their table, avoiding eye contact with Sandra, Keanu, and Mia. Though the tension had passed, Sandra couldn't forget the disdain that had filled the air just moments earlier. She wondered how long it would take for some people to truly change their minds. Keanu's presence was like a shield, somehow comforting but also a reminder of just how deeply the world could be divided, how a small act of kindness could turn the tides, but also how fragile the space for that kindness was. Sandra shook her head slightly, as if trying to clear the thoughts that weighed heavy in her mind. She wasn't used to thinking this much about societal issues. But Mia had a way of making you reflect, of making you question things you might normally let slide. Mia was now sketching with intense focus, her small hands moving with surprising precision for a child her age. She wasn't just drawing a tree anymore, her work was evolving into something more intricate, more personal. Sandra watched in silence, her heart swelling with pride for the little girl who had found the courage to open up. Keanu, who had been trying and failing to draw a convincing tree, leaned back in his chair, eyes sparkling with amusement. I think I've got it now, Mia, he said, holding up his page triumphantly. His drawing was far from a masterpiece, but it was clear that he was trying. Mia paused, looked over at his paper, then nodded slowly. It's okay. But I think you missed a branch, she said with a smile that had a tinge of confidence. Sandra chuckled at the back and forth between the two. In a way, it was easy to forget that Mia was so young, she seemed so wise beyond her years. I think I'll leave the drawing to you, Mia, Keanu said, setting his pencil down with exaggerated relief. You're the expert here. Mia's face lit up, and she took the pencil back from him, her small fingers curling around it as she began to sketch another tree. This time, she added delicate swirls for the wind and a few clouds in the sky. It was simple, but there was a beauty to it that captured Sandra's attention. The picture was like a window into the little girl's world, and Sandra felt lucky to witness it. But there was something deeper in the exchange, something unspoken, something that lingered between Sandra and Keanu, even as they focused on the drawing. They were both aware of the unspoken truth about Mia, that there was a story behind her quietness, a reason why she was sitting at this table with them. Sandra looked over at Keanu. She could see that he was aware of it too. His expression was unreadable for a moment, and then, just as she was about to ask him what was on his mind, he leaned forward slightly, catching her eye. So, what do you think? Keanu asked quietly, his voice soft but carrying a weight Sandra wasn't used to hearing from him. Do you think she's just here because of some random situation, or is there something else going on? Sandra exhaled slowly, unsure of how to respond. The question was loaded, and she could feel the weight of it in her chest. I don't know, she said honestly. But I don't think it's random. She doesn't just show up at a restaurant like this without reason. I mean, look at her. She's scared. But she's not just scared of the waiter or the people in here. She's scared of something bigger. Keanu nodded, his gaze falling to the table. You think she's been through something serious? Sandra didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The answer was clear in her mind. Mia was too quiet, too withdrawn for her age. There was something haunting in the way she looked at the world, like she had seen too much, too young. Keanu seemed to read her thoughts. Yeah, I get that feeling too, he said, his voice low. But what are we supposed to do about it? We can't change what happened to her. We can't undo whatever caused her to be so guarded. Sandra's heart clenched at the reality of his words. There was truth in them, but there was also a spark of something else. They couldn't change the past, but they could offer the kind of safe space Mia needed, now, in this moment. They could be the people who showed her that the world didn't have to be cruel. I don't know, Sandra admitted. But we can be here for her. We can give her a moment of peace. A place to feel safe. Keanu's eyes softened, and he gave her a quiet nod. There was understanding in his expression, and for a moment, the weight of their responsibility seemed to lift, if only slightly. They might not be able to fix everything, but they could help. That was something. Just then, Mia looked up from her drawing, her face breaking into a small, tentative smile. She held up the paper proudly, showing them her finished picture of the tree. Sandra's heart warmed. Mia, that's beautiful, she said, her voice filled with admiration. You're really talented. Mia's smile widened at the praise, and for the first time, Sandra saw a flicker of true joy in her eyes. It was a small thing, but it felt like a victory, a quiet, unspoken triumph over whatever had tried to silence Mia's spirit. Keanu leaned in and smiled at her. You've definitely got a future as an artist, Mia. I'm impressed. Mia giggled, clearly pleased. She placed the paper down carefully on the table and seemed to shrink a little in her seat, as though she were unsure of what to do next. Sandra could feel the girl's uncertainty, but this time, there was something different about it, something softer, less guarded. Mia was starting to trust them, even if only a little. And that, Sandra realized, was a start. The moment was quiet, but it was full of understanding. For a brief second, the three of them sat together, strangers, yet somehow connected, bonded by something deeper than just a shared meal. It wasn't about the drawing or the confrontation with the waiter anymore. It was about what came after, the quiet moments of connection, the unspoken understanding that sometimes, just being there for someone could be the most important thing you could do. As the restaurant buzzed around them, Sandra realized that this was exactly what Mia needed. She didn't need answers. She didn't need grand gestures. She just needed a moment of peace. And maybe, just maybe, she had found it. The afternoon stretched on, the restaurant now bathed in the golden hue of the setting sun, casting a warm glow over the table. The moment between Sandra, Keanu, and Mia felt almost suspended in time, as though nothing in the world could break the fragile peace they had found together. Keanu, ever the jokester, kept the mood light, making silly faces to coax more giggles out of Mia. And while Sandra couldn't help but smile at the child's laughter, there was a knot of concern still tight in her chest. What had happened to Mia? Why was she here alone? She could tell there was so much more to the story, and while she didn't want to pry too deeply, the question lingered in the back of her mind. The atmosphere was lighter, but there was an undercurrent of something heavier, something unspoken that none of them had yet addressed. As they sat there, finishing their meal, Sandra leaned back in her chair, glancing out the window. The world beyond seemed so distant, so unaffected by the small world they had created around their table. She found herself lost in thought, when Mia's small voice brought her back to the present. Mia? Sandra asked softly, her eyes finding the little girl's gaze. Is there something you want to talk about? You know, anything at all. Mia had been unusually quiet since their earlier conversation, her hand still lightly gripping the crayon as she had returned to her sketching, her face turned down to the paper. At Sandra's gentle question, Mia paused for a moment, and then slowly, almost hesitantly, placed her crayon down. She looked up at Sandra, her eyes wide, as if unsure whether she could trust her words. I don't like being alone," Mia said in a voice barely above a whisper. The words, though soft, cut through the quiet in a way that made Sandra's heart ache. "I know, sweetheart," Sandra replied gently, her tone laced with empathy. "Being alone is tough. But you're not alone now, okay? We're here for you." Mia's lips trembled slightly, and Sandra could see the walls she had so carefully built around herself starting to crack, just a little. Her eyes flicked to Keanu, who had been watching silently, his expression soft but attentive. "Mia, sweetheart, can I ask you something?" Sandra's voice was calm, steady, as if to reassure the child that there was no pressure. "Do you have a home? A family who takes care of you?" The question hung in the air, and for a long moment, Mia didn't respond. Instead, she twisted her napkin in her hands, the movement slow and deliberate, as if trying to find the right words. Keanu shifted in his seat, his eyes never leaving the little girl. Finally, Mia's voice broke the silence again, quieter this time. "I have an aunt," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "She takes care of me. But sometimes, she's busy, and I don't see her much." Sandra nodded, her heart both heavy and relieved at the same time. It was a little reassurance that Mia wasn't entirely alone, but there was still something about her words that didn't sit right. Why had she ended up in this restaurant by herself? Why had she looked so scared? Keanu leaned forward then, his voice low and gentle. "Mia, I don't know what happened, but I want you to know something," he said. "No matter what, we'll make sure you're okay. You're safe here with us." Mia didn't answer immediately, but Sandra could see the tension in her small shoulders beginning to ease. She wasn't fully trusting yet, but she was beginning to accept their words, their promises. And that was something. Before either of them could speak again, a sudden voice broke into their quiet moment. "Excuse me, ma'am," a familiar voice from earlier rang out. Sandra turned to see the waiter approaching their table, his face a mix of hesitation and uncertainty. "I just wanted to apologize for earlier," he said, his voice quieter now, less brash than it had been. "I shouldn't have acted the way I did. I was wrong." Sandra's brow furrowed as she studied him. This wasn't the same man who had confronted her with disdain. This was a softer version, and something about it didn't sit right. "It's okay," Sandra replied, trying to keep the conversation neutral, though a part of her felt conflicted. She wasn't sure if this was genuine or if the waiter was simply trying to make amends because he had been caught in his behavior. "But I hope you'll understand that people, especially kids, shouldn't be treated that way. Everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are." The waiter nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I understand, ma'am. I'm really sorry. It won't happen again." Sandra simply nodded in response, the apology feeling hollow but necessary. She didn't need to dwell on it anymore, but it was clear that the situation had left a mark, not just on her but on the waiter as well. For a brief moment, she wondered if he would remember the lesson or simply revert to his old ways. As the waiter walked away, Keanu glanced at Sandra, his expression thoughtful. "You think he'll change?" he asked, his voice quiet. Sandra shook her head slightly, her lips pressed together in contemplation. "I don't know. People don't always change because they're told to. But sometimes, if they have a reason to reflect on their actions, it might make a difference. At least, I hope it does." Keanu nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah. I guess all we can do is hope." The conversation shifted after that, but Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important brewing beneath the surface, something bigger than the apology or the waiter's attitude. Mia was still here, still silent, her small hand gripping her drawing paper as though it was the only thing keeping her grounded. As the last remnants of their meal were cleared away, Sandra felt an unfamiliar sense of urgency building inside her. She had come to this restaurant thinking she was just having lunch. But now, after everything that had happened, it felt as though their paths were intertwined in ways none of them could have predicted. Mia wasn't just a little girl who needed help, she was a person in need of a safe place, a voice that would speak up for her when no one else did. Keanu, sensing the shift in Sandra's demeanor, looked at her with a soft expression. "You're thinking about the bigger picture, aren't you?" he asked, almost as if reading her mind. Sandra exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yeah. I think there's more to Mia's story. And I want to help. I want to make sure she's okay." And just like that, the question that had been haunting her since the moment they'd met was answered. She wasn't just here to have lunch or to share a quiet afternoon. She was here to be part of Mia's journey, to help guide her through the uncertainty, the pain, and the fear that still lingered in the shadows. As the sun began to set outside, casting its final rays through the restaurant's windows, Sandra knew that whatever happened next, this moment had marked a turning point for all of them. They had started a journey they couldn't turn back from. And for the first time in a long while, Sandra felt ready to face whatever came next. The days following the afternoon at the restaurant were quieter, but the conversation, the promise, lingered in Sandra's mind. She couldn't shake the image of Mia's wide eyes, full of fear and hope in equal measure. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Mia wasn't just a child in need of a kind word, she was a child whose life had been shaped by something far beyond her years, a pain too deep for her small shoulders to carry alone. Sandra had gone home that night feeling unsettled. She had found herself staring at the ceiling long after her head hit the pillow, wrestling with a question she didn't have an answer for. How could she help? What could she possibly do for Mia that would make a real difference? But the more Sandra thought about it, the more she realized that the first step was simple, she just had to show up. Show up and be there. Mia needed stability, a sense of security, something that went beyond the casual kindness of strangers. She needed a safe place, someone to trust. She thought back to that afternoon, to the way Keanu had been so naturally supportive, and how Mia had responded to his kindness. Keanu was a rock, calm and steady, always there when needed. But Sandra knew that this was going to be more than just a day of drawing pictures. If Mia was going to move past whatever shadows clung to her, they would have to help her make a bigger change, a real change. The following morning, Sandra couldn't ignore the pull to do something more. She grabbed her phone and hesitated for just a moment before dialing Keanu's number. "Hey," Sandra's voice was soft when he picked up, but there was a determination beneath it. "Are you free today? I think it's time we do something more for Mia." Keanu's response was immediate, his voice clear and full of concern. "Of course. What do you have in mind?" Sandra smiled faintly, relieved by his immediate willingness to help. "I'm thinking we start looking into some options for her. She can't keep living like this, alone, in and out of situations where she's not safe. We need to find out more about her aunt and her living situation. Maybe there's something we can do to help her." Keanu was silent for a moment, clearly processing what Sandra was saying. When he spoke again, there was a note of quiet resolve in his tone. "Let's do it. We can't let her slip through the cracks." Sandra felt a wave of gratitude flood through her. She wasn't sure she could do it alone, but with Keanu's help, it felt like they could make a real difference. "I'll meet you at the restaurant in an hour." "Sounds good," he replied, and the line clicked off. At the restaurant, Sandra arrived early, as usual, and sat at their table, her mind running through the possibilities. She hadn't told Mia what they were planning, she didn't want to overwhelm her, but Sandra knew it was time. They couldn't just let her continue to drift through life, unsure of who to turn to for help. When Keanu walked in, he looked just as determined as she felt. He gave her a small nod before taking a seat, his eyes glancing over the restaurant. But Sandra could tell he wasn't looking at the food, at the people around them. His mind, like hers, was focused entirely on what they were about to do. Mia arrived a few minutes later, holding her crayon drawings close to her chest, her small face still carrying the uncertainty they had seen before. She walked up to the table, looking up at Sandra with wide eyes. "Hey, Mia," Sandra said gently, trying to soften the moment. "How are you today?" Mia didn't respond immediately, her eyes flicking from Sandra to Keanu, then down at her drawings. For a long moment, it seemed like she was debating whether or not to speak. Finally, she said in her quiet voice, "I'm okay." Keanu smiled warmly. "You sure? I can tell you've been working hard on those drawings. You've got a real talent, Mia." Mia's lips twitched up into a shy smile, but she didn't say anything. Sandra's heart softened as she looked at the little girl. It was hard not to see the layers of caution in her eyes, the invisible walls she had built to protect herself. It wasn't her fault. She had learned to hide her pain because it was safer that way. "Mia," Sandra began slowly, her voice soft but clear, "we've been thinking about what you told us the other day. About your aunt. And we want to make sure you're okay. We want to help you find a safe place where you don't have to be scared anymore. You deserve that." Mia's eyes flicked up to Sandra's face, and for the briefest of moments, Sandra thought she saw a flicker of hope, before the walls came back up again. The little girl's face went unreadable, and she shrank back slightly, clutching her drawings even tighter to her chest. Sandra's heart ached as she watched Mia's defensive posture. It was clear the girl was afraid of change, afraid of the uncertainty that would come with it. She had been let down too many times before. But Sandra wasn't backing down. "Listen, Mia," she said softly, leaning forward just a little to get on the child's level. "We're not asking you to do anything you're not ready for. But we want to help you. And sometimes, that means asking for help from people who can give you the support you need. Like your aunt, or maybe someone else who can look out for you." Mia looked up at her, her lips trembling slightly as she seemed to process the words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, she spoke. "I don't want to go to a new place. I don't want to leave Aunt Lily." Sandra felt her chest tighten, the pain in Mia's words cutting deep. It was so clear now, Mia's aunt was the only thing that had kept her tethered to this world, even if that safety was tenuous at best. If Mia was so attached to her, it meant the little girl had been through too much already, had already seen too many changes in her short life. "Hey," Keanu said gently, breaking the silence with a warm, encouraging smile. "You don't have to go anywhere you don't want to. We'll work together on this. No one is going to force you to do anything. But you have people who care about you now, Mia. And that means we're all going to make sure you're okay, no matter what happens." Sandra nodded, her heart heavy but determined. "We're with you, every step of the way. I promise." Mia looked up at them, her small face still uncertain, but there was something different in her eyes this time. The wall wasn't as thick as before, the distance wasn't as far. It would take time, but Sandra could feel the first fragile thread of trust between them beginning to form. As the weight of their conversation hung in the air, Sandra knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning of Mia's journey. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be fast, but they would face it together. And that was more than enough. The following days felt heavy, like the weight of unspoken words and unanswered questions had taken root in the air. Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that Mia's situation was far more complicated than she had originally realized. The walls Mia had built were thick, built from years of uncertainty, from being let down, and from a life where safety and security were distant dreams, not everyday realities. Sandra spent the next morning researching, reaching out to local child services, trying to get more information about Mia's aunt, Aunt Lily. What kind of guardian had she been? Was she capable of taking care of Mia? Sandra had so many questions, and it seemed like every answer only led to more. She made phone calls, sent emails, and spent hours trying to find the missing pieces that could give her a clearer picture of Mia's home life. Keanu was there every step of the way, his quiet encouragement helping Sandra stay focused. He had his own way of moving through the world, calm, methodical, and patient. Sandra couldn't help but admire that about him. He didn't rush to conclusions. He didn't let the urgency of the situation cloud his judgment. Instead, he took it one step at a time, exactly as they needed to. But as the day wore on, it became clear that the answers Sandra was looking for weren't going to come easily. Child Services had nothing on record regarding Mia or Aunt Lily. There were no documented complaints, no reports of neglect or abuse. It was as if Mia and her aunt existed in some kind of gray area, slipping through the cracks. Finally, after hours of trying to make sense of everything, Sandra closed her laptop with a sigh. "There's nothing," she said, frustrated. "No paper trail, no reports. It's like Mia and her aunt are invisible." Keanu, who had been flipping through a magazine in the corner, set it aside and looked up. Maybe that's a good thing. It could mean Mia's been in a relatively stable environment. Maybe Aunt Lily isn't perfect, but if there's nothing on file, maybe that means she's doing enough to keep things under control. Sandra rubbed her temples. Maybe. But that doesn't explain why Mia's so scared. Why she's so hesitant to trust anyone. We don't know what's going on in that home. We don't know what's going wrong. Keanu stood up, crossing the room to stand beside Sandra. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support. "You're doing everything you can. Don't lose hope. It's just going to take time. Sometimes you don't get all the answers right away. Sometimes it's about making sure Mia knows we're here for her, that she's not alone." Sandra met his gaze, grateful for his unwavering calm. "You're right. It's just so hard. I want to fix this for her. I want to make it better. But I don't even know where to start." Keanu smiled gently. "Start by showing her you care. Keep showing up. Keep being there for her, just like you've been. Sometimes the biggest change comes from the smallest gestures." Sandra nodded, taking a deep breath. Keanu's words brought a sense of peace she hadn't realized she needed. It wasn't about fixing everything overnight. It was about creating a safe space for Mia, a space where she could let down her guard and start to heal. As the days went by, Sandra and Keanu continued to visit the restaurant. Every time they saw Mia, they made sure to show up with smiles and warmth. They didn't push her to talk or to open up, but they were there, day after day, offering a steady presence in a world that must have felt anything but stable for her. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the restaurant floor, Mia finally broke her silence. "Mia?" Sandra's voice was soft, her eyes meeting the little girl's. "How are you feeling today?" Mia looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously around the edges of her crayon drawing. For a long time, she said nothing, her gaze glued to the table. Then, with a small voice, barely a whisper, she spoke. "I'm scared," Mia admitted, her voice trembling. Sandra's heart ached, but she didn't say anything at first. Instead, she gently leaned forward, her eyes warm with understanding. "What are you scared of, Mia?" The little girl's lip quivered, and she hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm scared Aunt Lily will stop loving me. That she'll be too busy for me. That I'll be alone." Sandra's breath caught in her throat. It was so clear now, Mia didn't just want to be loved. She needed to feel secure, to feel like she had a place in this world where she mattered. And the fear that she would lose her place in Aunt Lily's life, that she would be cast aside, was more than just a fear. It was a reality Mia had lived with for too long. "I understand," Sandra said softly, her voice full of empathy. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, Mia?" Mia nodded, the tears welling up in her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, but Sandra had already seen. She knew what Mia was trying to hide, the fear, the uncertainty, the loneliness. "Listen to me, okay?" Sandra continued, her voice firm but kind. "You are not alone. Not anymore. We are here for you. And we'll help you figure this out. Whatever happens, you don't have to face it by yourself." Mia's big eyes looked up at Sandra, searching for the truth in her words. And for the first time in a long while, Sandra felt as though the little girl was starting to believe her. The next morning, Sandra and Keanu took the next step. They went to visit Aunt Lily's house. They didn't know what they were walking into, but they had made up their minds. It was time to meet the woman who had been caring for Mia, for better or worse. Sandra had to see for herself the environment Mia was living in, to know whether she was being truly cared for or if there was more to the story than anyone was telling. When they arrived, Aunt Lily's house seemed quiet, a modest little home tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. The paint on the exterior had faded, and the lawn was overgrown, but it looked like a place where people had lived and tried to make the best of things. Sandra's nerves were on edge as they walked up to the front door, Keanu at her side, offering silent support. They rang the doorbell and waited, their hearts pounding in anticipation. Would they find the answers they were looking for? Or would they find something darker, something that would make everything they had worked for seem like a futile effort? The door creaked open, and a woman stood there, her face lined with years of hard work and worry. Sandra took a deep breath. It was time to face the unknown. The door creaked open slowly, and Sandra was met with the gaze of a woman whose tired eyes seemed to hold a lifetime of burdens. Aunt Lily wasn't what Sandra had expected, not a villainous figure, but a woman clearly worn down by life. Her hair was messy, and her clothes were simple, but there was something in her posture that made Sandra pause, something that suggested she was trying her best, even if her best didn't seem enough. "Can I help you?" Aunt Lily's voice was soft but wary, as though she was accustomed to being questioned or judged. Sandra smiled gently, trying to ease the tension in the air. "Hi, I'm Sandra, and this is Keanu. We've been talking with Mia lately." Aunt Lily's expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a flicker of something that made Sandra wonder just how much the woman knew about the situation. "Mia's been spending some time with us," Keanu added, his voice calm and steady. "We just wanted to check in, make sure everything is okay." Aunt Lily hesitated before stepping aside, allowing them to enter the house. It wasn't much, small, a little cramped, with mismatched furniture and toys scattered across the floor, but it had a lived-in quality. A place where people had made do, where people had tried to make it work. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn against the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows over the room. A faint smell of something cooking lingered in the air, but the atmosphere was quiet, almost somber. Sandra noticed a few worn photographs on the walls, pictures of Mia as a younger child, along with what appeared to be snapshots of Aunt Lily and other family members. The walls didn't tell a story of neglect, but neither did they tell a story of joy. They told a story of survival. "Mia talks a lot about you," Sandra said, her voice gentle. "She's really fond of you. But we've noticed that she seems anxious sometimes. Like she's afraid of something." Aunt Lily looked down, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I don't know what to say. I try, I really do. But sometimes it feels like no matter how hard I try, it's never enough." Sandra's heart ached. She had thought Mia's fear was something more external, something in the world around her, something she could fix, but this felt different. It wasn't just that Mia was scared of something outside herself. Mia was scared of being abandoned, of being unloved by the one person who was supposed to care for her most. It was a fear that ran deep, a fear that might have been built over years of neglect, or perhaps simply a fear born from too many changes in a short amount of time. "I know it's been hard," Sandra said softly. "But Mia needs to feel safe. She needs to know she's not alone in this world." Aunt Lily nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. "I'm doing the best I can, but it's just me. And sometimes, I'm not enough. I'm not enough for her. I've tried to give her everything, but I'm barely holding it together myself." Sandra looked at Keanu, who had been silently observing the conversation, his expression unreadable. There was a heavy weight in the room now, a weight that couldn't be ignored. Aunt Lily wasn't a bad person. She wasn't intentionally hurting Mia. But she was struggling. She was doing what she could, but the cracks were showing, and Mia was the one feeling the effects. "I'm sure you're doing your best, Aunt Lily," Sandra said, her voice soft but firm. "But Mia needs more than just survival. She needs love. She needs stability. She needs someone to show her that she can trust the world again." Aunt Lily's shoulders slumped, and she looked defeated, like a woman at the end of her rope. "I know. I just don't know how to fix things. I've tried to keep it together, but every time I think we're getting somewhere, something else happens. And Mia just keeps pulling away. She's so afraid. I don't know how to help her." Keanu stepped forward then, his voice steady and kind. "We understand. But sometimes, it's not about fixing everything. Sometimes, it's about showing up. It's about being there when she needs you, even if it feels like you're not doing enough." Sandra nodded in agreement. "We're here to help you, Aunt Lily. You don't have to do this alone. But we need to know that you're ready to make some changes. For Mia's sake." Aunt Lily wiped her eyes and nodded slowly. "I don't know if I can change everything. But I'll try. I'll do whatever I can to make sure she feels safe." There was a long silence, and for a moment, Sandra wasn't sure if she'd heard the words she needed to hear. But slowly, Aunt Lily met her eyes, a look of resolve finally creeping into her features. "I'll try," Aunt Lily repeated, more firmly this time. "I don't know what I'll do, but I'll try." Sandra felt a sense of relief flood through her, mixed with the understanding that this wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be fast. But it was a start. Aunt Lily was ready to fight for Mia. And that meant, together, they could create a foundation of trust and safety for the little girl. As Sandra and Keanu left Aunt Lily's house, the weight in the air seemed a little lighter. The uncertainty wasn't gone, but it had shifted. Now, there was a glimmer of hope where before there had been only doubt. "Do you think she'll be able to do it?" Keanu asked, breaking the silence between them as they walked down the driveway. Sandra sighed, glancing over at him. "I don't know. But at least she's willing to try. And that's more than we had before." Keanu nodded, his expression thoughtful. "One step at a time, right?" Sandra smiled faintly. "Yeah. One step at a time." It was a long road ahead, but for the first time in a while, Sandra felt like they were headed in the right direction. Mia had people who cared about her. She had a future, even if that future wasn't clear yet. But together, they would figure it out. They had to. It was an overcast afternoon when Sandra and Keanu left Aunt Lily's house, the weight of the conversation still lingering between them. The moment they stepped outside, the world seemed a little quieter, as though the universe was giving them a moment to absorb what had just transpired. The promise Aunt Lily had made to try harder, to show up for Mia, wasn't something that could be taken lightly. It wasn't a resolution that would fix everything overnight, but it was a promise, a commitment to change, however difficult it might be. "Do you think she'll keep her word?" Keanu asked as they walked back to the car, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. Sandra took a deep breath and glanced up at the sky. The clouds hung low, casting a shadow over the street, but there was something oddly comforting about the way they seemed to press in, wrapping everything in a hushed silence. I think so. I don't think Aunt Lily is bad, Keanu. She's been trying to survive. Maybe for so long, she forgot what it meant to truly live, what it meant to take care of someone who needs more than just survival. Keanu nodded. It's easy to get lost in just getting by. Sandra met his gaze, offering a small smile. Yeah. But now Mia's not alone. Not anymore. They reached the car, and Sandra paused before opening the door, her thoughts still swirling. I think it's time we made a plan for Mia, she said, her voice steady. We need to help her start to believe again. To feel like the world can be a safe place. But that's not going to happen unless we show up. Not just for her, but for Aunt Lily too. Keanu gave a low chuckle. You're not one to back down, huh? Sandra grinned. You've noticed? I'd say that's an understatement, Keanu teased. He opened the door for her and then slid into the car beside her, his eyes on the road ahead. Let's make sure we show up, then. For Mia. For Aunt Lily. For everyone who needs it. The following weeks were filled with small victories, tiny moments that felt like monumental steps. Sandra and Keanu continued visiting the restaurant, keeping their promise to Mia that they wouldn't disappear. And though Mia remained quiet and cautious, her smiles became a little more frequent, her laughter a little louder. They could see the walls beginning to crack, just slightly. And though Mia didn't talk much about her fears, it was clear that she was beginning to trust them in her own way. Aunt Lily, too, made efforts. Slowly, she started reaching out to Sandra for advice, asking questions about parenting, about how to create a more stable environment for Mia. It was a start. A small one. But it was a start nonetheless. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of work at the restaurant, Sandra and Keanu found themselves sitting on the steps outside the small house they were renting. The sun had just set, and the night air was cool, carrying the scent of rain that had yet to fall. Do you think Mia will ever fully heal from everything? Sandra asked quietly, her gaze focused on the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight were fading into the dark. Keanu shifted beside her, his voice soft but steady. I think she'll get there. It's going to take time. But I don't think she's ever going to be the same person she was when we met her. And that's okay. People change, sometimes in ways we can't see right away. But I think Mia's on the right path. Sandra nodded, her chest tight with emotion. It's just hard. I want so badly for her to have a normal life. A happy one. But it feels like we're all still just finding our way. Keanu's hand found hers, his grip warm and steady. You're doing great, Sandra. You're giving her what she needs right now, a stable foundation. That's more than a lot of people get. And sometimes, that's all it takes to start changing the story. Sandra leaned back, allowing herself to lean into his words. I hope you're right. In the distance, thunder rumbled faintly, and Sandra felt a slight shift in the air, as though something was about to change, something important. But she didn't feel afraid. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could face whatever came next with strength, with hope. They weren't alone anymore. And that made all the difference. It wasn't long before they had their answer. The day Mia's world finally shifted, when the walls that had held her back came crashing down. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Mia had come over to the house to spend some time with Sandra and Keanu, as they had done many times before. She had been quiet as usual, scribbling in her notebook, drawing her colorful pictures of superheroes and animals, creating a world where she had control, where she was safe. But today was different. As Mia stood up to hand Sandra her drawing, her small hands trembling slightly, Sandra could see something was different in her eyes. They weren't the wide, fearful eyes of a little girl who expected the worst. No, today, they were eyes that spoke of something else, something softer, something more trusting. I made this for you, Mia said, her voice small but steady. It's you and Keanu, and me. We're all heroes. We save the day. Sandra's heart caught in her throat, the emotion threatening to spill over. She crouched down to Mia's level, taking the drawing carefully in her hands. The picture was simple, 3 figures in a line, each with a cape. But it was the way Mia had drawn them that left Sandra speechless. There they were, all together, side by side. No distance. No fear. This is beautiful, Mia, Sandra said, her voice thick with emotion. You really are a hero, you know that? Mia smiled, a little unsure of herself, but the corners of her lips tugged up, as if she was finally allowing herself to believe it. I think I'm starting to believe it, Mia whispered, almost to herself. Sandra blinked away the tears that had welled up in her eyes. In that moment, she realized something she hadn't fully understood before. Mia had found something she hadn't known she needed. Trust. Safety. Love. And for the first time in her life, Mia had found a place where she could belong. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be hard days, moments when Mia's fears would resurface, and when Aunt Lily would struggle. But for the first time in a long while, Sandra had hope. She had hope that Mia, with the support of everyone who cared about her, would heal. She had hope that they were all going to be okay. The journey wasn't over. But it was beginning to feel like it could be the right kind of beginning, the kind that was full of possibility. Sandra looked up at Keanu, who was standing at the door, his arms crossed, a soft smile playing on his lips. He gave her a single nod, as if to say, "We've got this." And for the first time in a long time, Sandra believed him.